Hey everybody, I asked earlier for some people to log on and give me their music questions, and I got a lot of questions, which makes me really excited because there's a huge variety of things that I get to answer. So let me start from the top. Okay, so first question. Apart from music, what else inspires you? As I'm sure some of you who know me personally can attest to, I've been diving deep into philosophy and politics lately, and I've found a pretty intense inner peace just reading in general. So I've been trying to catch up on all the classics and learn, both fiction and nonfiction, catch up on all the things I need to try and figure out life a little bit more. But I would say reading and poetry and just storytelling in general has really inspired the hell out of me lately. How to get out of the box while phrasing. This is a great question because I think you can refer to a few different types of phrasing. There's definitely harmonic phrasing and rhythmic phrasing. I can't remember who I was studying with, but I took it was Terrence Blanchard. I did a masterclass with Terrence Blanchard one time, and he had mentioned, someone asked him a question about out of the box phrasing, and he gave a really interesting example where he would come in on different bars each time. Like if he took a consistent solo every night, he would go through and he would say, okay, I'm going to start 2 bars beforehand, or he would start a bar and a half afterwards, and he would pick certain beats to come in. And so I've really been trying to do that where, if I know I'm going to take a solo, for instance, like in Corey's band, there's certain tunes where I always take solos. And so on these tunes, I will go through and I'll kind of give myself a beat that I have to start on. So for instance, on a tune like he does a Prince cover of 1999, I'll come in, on beat 2 of the second bar. And I found what that does is it gives me kind of a unique approach to where I have to react to different things that are going on with the rest of the band that would normally, we normally kind of aim for the one or aim to like go all the way super into the solo really quickly. And, I think that's a situation where rhythmically that can give you some different phrasing. I think in terms of, harmony and phrasing harmonically a little bit more, that stuff just really kind of depends on the mood. I mean, if I've been traveling all day and I'm in a really dark place or something like that, because as you know, the road gets to be a little rough sometimes. I may just go right away into some really out stuff and just make the whole vibe really dissonant. I think that if you let your mood dictate what you're doing, you won't even really need to ask the question because you're just going to feel a certain way and you'll phrase that way. Got a cool chord progression. There's so many. I will say my favorite chord progression, and this is going to seem pretty normal, but I'm violently in love with just a 1 major triad to the 3 minor. I remember I used to listen to a lot of Sufjan Stevens back in the day, and I remember he had a tune where it was just those 2 chords back and forth, and man, it's just such a weird, beautiful, like really happy to really sad kind of like thing that just goes back and forth. And so I think those 2 changes, especially if you can kind of play off of them and make them interesting somehow, that's probably my favorite chord progression. What is your approach on harmonic soloing over a 1 chord vamp? Love your harmonies. Well, thank you for the compliment. The cool thing about 1 chord vamps is that you have every option on the planet. Like if you're playing a tune that has a ton of changes, you can go outside of the box a little bit, but most of your outside of the boxiness is kind of based more on how you're reacting to the changes. If there's a 2-5-1 progression or something like that, you might be doing like a 2-5-1 trick, or maybe I'll throw, a church trick in there to get around it. But with 1 chord vamps, you can kind of go wherever you want. Some people will play it really safe and just kind of take a bluesy approach and just say, I'm only going to play this vibe or this scale. I've heard like a guy like Eric Gales. I think someone actually just asked favorite guitarist. I think Eric Gales might be my guy. Or Adam Agati from our band is another great player. But you'll hear kind of the blues approach where they're playing it not safe, but safe harmonically, where they're just sticking to one vibe and it's totally fine. Or, to flip it, I'll hear a guy like John Medeski, kind of a jazz piano player, where he's very rarely even in the key that the song is in. You know, so I think approach-wise, you know, again, I kind of let my mood dictate where I go. You know, if it's something where I'm trying to kind of portray beauty, I'm in a really good mood, or if the song is really delicate, I'm probably not going to go too far outside of the box. But if it's a funk vibe, I'm going everywhere, you know, or like a dark modern jazz kind of vibe. Like if we're in C, I'm not playing in C very often. And I think approach-wise, you know, it's just a whole lot of coming in and going out. It's something where if you start in C and then you go to B for a second and then come back to C, you know, those tricks, especially if you can do them fluidly and not stop in between them, they give you, you know, a lot of really interesting phrasing power. Favorite synth sounds. I grew up, I'm an interesting synth person, I think, because most synth players are kind of in love with these, you know, 70s, 80s kind of original, you know, the Prophet 5 patches, and, you know, you would hear bands like The Cars or like Journey and all this stuff using really specific synth sounds. I did used to listen to a bunch of Pink Floyd too, and they had really great synthesizers. I think I burned myself out on that stuff really early, and so now when I hear synth sounds that I want to do, I'm really latching on to kind of more modern approaches. I've said this a few times before in different lessons and Q&As I've done, but I'm really in love with kind of the English underground hip-hop R&B production scene over there, and I think they've really, you know, especially people like James Blake and Jay Paul have really kind of come at synths from an angle that, you know, maybe it's been done before. Someone who would know the history a little better could probably correct me on that. But, you know, those people really kind of took certain synth sounds and almost combined them with R&B in a way that I hadn't heard. So I latch on to kind of more modern synth kind of things like that. At what hours of the day am I most creative? Whatever hour that coffee happens. You know, if I'm on the road and I had to use the day to kind of recover from jet lag, if I have coffee at 5 p.m., that's when I'm shedding. Or if I have coffee at midnight, that's when I'm shedding. I hate that coffee dictates that, but that's definitely what it does. 4 major 7 sharp 5 or flat 7 7 sharp 11, 1 major 7. That's my answer. 1 major 7. Saw your public playlist. That would be on Spotify. Know our stuff to learn. That's badass. Did you make your Orin patches or did something? You know what? Those patches were actually kind of an interesting challenge for me because you know, Lewis is a really great sound designer, and he has a very certain aesthetic that comes with his synth design, and it's very different than what I normally did. So it was cool for me where, you know, I designed the patches, but it was definitely trying to fit into his mold. I think I got them pretty close to the records. That group is fun for me because you have Jacob Mann also playing keys, at least on the tours I've done. I know Ray, I'm going to butcher his last name, but Ray Thistlethwaite and Dennis Ham also do that gig, and they have great sounds. So there's kind of been a solid foundation of the synth process laid down in that group. But I definitely learned the patches from the record and then recreated them for the live performance. What are your top 3 keyboards, and what keyboard would you choose for certain sounds? Piano, Rhodes, something. That is a great question. I think if I give you a broad answer, I'm going to say I'm obviously a huge Dave Smith fan. I think all of the Prophets, you know, from the 5 to the X to the Rev 2 to the 12, they're all great. They all do very different things. So Prophets in general, that's my synth of choice. I'm really in love with the Yamaha refaces. I think that, you know, it's been something to where there hasn't really been a good warm-up situation for keyboard players in the past. You know, unless you're using a MIDI controller and a laptop. But I think that the Yamaha has done a great thing by giving you these boards that not only sound great when you hear them live, but they also have, you know, are battery powered and have speakers. So you can take them backstage and you can do some really great stuff, you know, warming up, and you can record with them and you can play them on stage. So, you know, I definitely go with Prophets, the Yamaha refaces, and I think my live or die keyboard of choice forever would be just the Wurlitzer electric piano, and really all the models of them, other than the organs. Wasn't really into the Wurlitzer organs, but Wurlitzer electric pianos are definitely something that I think if I had to be alone on a desert island, that's all I'm bringing. It's just such a soulful thing, and it's got this kind of like weird duality between, it can get really angry sounding and really dark, but it can also be really delicate. It can be really bluesy, really soulful. And I always kind of preferred that sound to the Rhodes kind of sound. What is your opinion for Mainstage or general music software for live? I will say, until recently, I've never been much of a software guy. I had some kind of weird experiences early on with Mainstage for Logic, to where I think that the program was too smart. It was too intuitive. I would play shows and I wouldn't map something, but it would be auto-mapped. And so I'd go to switch volume and I would turn on a trumpet patch or something crazy like that. So, I kind of shied away from them for a long time. I just started getting into Massive and some of the keyscape stuff, and I really like that. I think for now I'll probably stick with just hardware on stage, just because I feel like it's a little bit safer for me. It's one less thing you have to bring on, and I've seen and dealt with so many audio issues coming from interfaces live, to where I'll probably avoid that for now if I can. We'll definitely see what the future brings. Top 5 favorite keyboardists. Oh man, that's a great question. There's a couple obvious ones. I have to say Herbie Hancock. I have to say Bill Evans. I'll give a few. I guess Brad Meldau would be an obvious one too. My 2 off-the-cuff ones would be Red Garland. I was always in love with his phrasing. I thought that he kind of just epitomized jazz. It was like everything he played was very melodic, but it was very bouncy, and it had this certain kind of like jazz hump to it that really intrigued me. And then I think for my last one, I have to go with John Medeski. I listened to a ton of Medeski, Martin, and Wood when I was in college, and he had, he had that kind of dichotomy of really delicate, beautiful playing and just brutal, angry, distorted organ or clav, and he really knew how to kind of span the emotional spectrum of music, pretty efficiently. So, I think of the famous guys, those are probably my top 5. I have to shout out my friends, because I've learned so much just from the people that I've surrounded myself with. I was in New York and Brooklyn for about 6 years, and now I'm out here in LA. So I got to hang out with Corey Henry, obviously, Julian Pollock, Big Yuki, Jake Sherman, my buddy Christian Almiron and Brett Williams. And then coming out here, I got to know Jacob Mann, and I love his playing. Jason Lindner is someone who does some really crazy stuff that I totally dig. And I have to shout out, there's a guy back in Nebraska named Mitch Town, who was a really great organ player. He did some work on Terrace Martin's last record that came out, and he taught me a ton back when I was hanging out in Omaha, Nebraska, more where I grew up. So I have to shout those guys out, because I've learned just as much from them as I have from the heavies. Would you like to learn how to play a new instrument? I think in a perfect world where there was way more hours in a day, yeah, I definitely would. This is something to where I think the more instruments the more places you can come from musically. Honestly, I don't know if I ever will. I don't know if I'm ever going to put the time in that I would want to respect I want to respect the instrument I'm learning, and I just feel like there's so many great players at every instrument, like drummers and guitar players and bass players and horn players. There's so many good versions of those already. I would rather appreciate their voice and then try and, help their voice through my playing or deal with it that way. So probably not. I can't guarantee anything, but probably not. What is the best advice you can give on implementing synthesizers in jazz music? This is a great question. I think the first thing you can do is experiment texturally, as you're practicing improvising. Something that I had to kind of deal with when I first started getting into synthesis was there was a lot of phrasing differences. I had played piano and Wurlitzer for so long, and you're dealing with very specific attacks, very specific sustains on those instruments that when you play a synth, you can get there, but you have to build it. And when I first started, I wasn't really comfy with how to emulate those kind of approaches on the synthesizer. And so, it took me a while to really learn how to phrase on the synth. So I think experimenting with, different textures and different kind of ADSR settings will help you get through it. And I think something else too that I used to do a lot while I was practicing was, if you're transcribing in your practice, experiment with different patches. like if I'm playing along to a Charlie Parker solo, which on synth already kind of sounds strange, but it's fun to practice. If you try different patches, you're going to notice that each one has a different way you have to think about approaching it. If you're taking a really fat lead sound and you're trying to play along with the Parker line, you'll notice that the delicacy isn't really something that you can pay attention to. Whereas if you have like a really soft kind of like sine wave lead, or even if you have a synth patch with a really short sustain, you have to be rhythmically really on point because there's no hiding, because it's all right there. So I think my best advice is just experiment with different tones. I don't know that there's many rules past that, because there hasn't really been synthesizers and improvised music that extensively, in my opinion. There was definitely some great synth players, but even the people who were doing a lot of it weren't doing a lot of it. So that's the best advice I can give there. Prophet 8 or Rev 2, why? Well, they're kind of the same keyboard. So it depends on your budget. If budget isn't an issue, I would go with the Rev 2, just because, again, it's basically the same board, and you get effects, you get some extra modulators, you just get a little more bang for your buck, and there's more voices on the 16 voice model, which, especially if you're doing a lot of thick chords, really will end up mattering. Favorite key or scale to solo in, aka sound silky smooth? I think that you should be able to sound silky smooth in every key and every scale, and I think there's ways to do it. I can't really say I have a specific mode or key or scale. I've tried over my past 15-20 years of playing to really dive into not having weak keys, and each key kind of has its own elevation issues. I feel like there's definitely keys that blues is a little easier in, there's keys that church music's a little easier in, but that's kind of what makes them all beautiful, is that they all contain their own intricacies. So I don't really have a favorite. I think I just love the whole thing. Favorite weird pedal? That is a wonderful question. As you know, I'm very interested in all that. I will say, I don't know that I have one favorite weird pedal. I have a few go-tos, but the three companies I would say to check out in terms of strange things, is one, this company out of England called MWFX makes a great pedal that I use pretty often called the Judder, which is like a weird beat repeat kind of time messer-upper thing. There's a company called Red Panda out of Detroit that has some some pretty great delays and reverbs, and they have kind of a bit of the strange vibe to them. They also just came out with a pedal called the Tensor. That's what it's called. And I at one point had two of those on my board, because you can do a lot of weird time tricks again with that pedal. You can kind of have a pog vibe to it. You can do some kind of DJ like warping kind of sounds. It also has a really interesting looper on it. And then lastly, I would say check out a company called Dwarfcraft. I think they're out of Eau Claire. I'm probably butchering how that's pronounced, but they make really out pedals that, especially if you're getting experimental, they make some really great things, like weird auto filters and fuzzes that do interesting things. So I would start there with those three companies. What would you recommend for learning the jazz and funk style, literature, etc.? Well, if you're meaning jazz or funk, those are very different things. And I would say they probably take very different approaches. But if you're aiming for kind of what we refer to as the jazz funk people, I would say focus on the funk part first. Jazz, to me, out of the two of those, jazz is kind of more based on an improvisational kind of vibe. And, I think there's too many players now who focus on improvising and focus on soloing and really don't have decent time or decent groove. And those are the things that really provide the basis for great improvisation. I've noticed that the people who I respect the best as soloists, and Corey is one of these people, Corey Henry, he's someone who, he can obviously solo for days, but if you just hear him play a funk pattern or a groove on a whirly or organ or clav, it just grooves so hard. So, and you can hear that in his playing. His playing is definitely rooted in that. And I think that if he couldn't groove as hard, you wouldn't like his improvisations as much. I think if you had to pick one, if you had to pick either soloing or groove, I'm always going to go with groove, just because there's more of that. If you play a song, you're only improvising for a minute or a couple choruses or something like that. And groove is really the thing that's going to make it be interesting. It's going to make people move. It's going to get you paid. So I would say, focus on the funk part. Go back and transcribe James Brown guitar parts. Learn Parliament bass lines. Find things that loop. I mean, listen to hip hop, or just put old Tower of Power sections into Ableton or whatever you use on your computer, whatever DAW you use, and just loop parts and play along to them for an hour. Don't do any fills, don't do any solos, any reharms, any of that stuff. Really try and get to the point to where you're lining up, as a keyboard player. I transcribed really a ton of guitar players and a ton of bass players just because those people were much more common. There were some great funk keyboard players. Bernie Worrell was really great. The people in the meters were super killing. But I think looping onto some of those like James Brown guitar and bass lines really gave me a really solid sense of feel. So I would say for that style, focus on the funk part of it first, build your groove, and then after you feel like you're comfy in that area, then focus on improvising, and I think you'll be much more rooted in what you're doing. This is a heavy one. It is, what is music to you? Music saved my life. It saves my life every day. It's something to where, it is a job, it's a career, so there are parts of it that are a bit industry-based, and you have to figure out how you're going to get paid, how you're going to live. But, honestly, I think it's something to where music is just such a way to express yourself that you just can't really do in words, really. It's something to where this is a weird spiritual tip, but I've heard God described as moments. I've heard God described as a moment where you feel like this is exactly what's meant to be happening right now. And I think music to me is really the only time where I've ever felt that. I've been on stage and just had this incredible feeling of awe. And, I've been lucky enough, and I continue to be lucky enough to play with people who are just so at the top of their game musically, and they bring out so much emotion while you're playing that you just want to scream on stage. So music to me it's really everything. It's my number one thing. It's what I think about in the morning. It's what I think about at night. And it's my therapist. It's my religion. It's everything to me. What albums or artists influenced your synth playing, specifically your chordal stuff? If we focus on the chordal stuff, I mean, it would have to be just church music in general. I was playing at a church in New York for 5 or 6 years when I lived up in Brooklyn. And, a lot of that movement is just so intricate, and there's so many inner things weaving around. And it just so happens that there weren't, at the time, too many people doing that on synthesizer. There's so many great organ players. But A, it's tough to bring an organ to a gig. And B, most fake organs don't really sound that good. So, I never really fell in love with the organ. I had one growing up, but it didn't have pedals. So it kind of inhibited me when I started playing at church. So I started trying some of those movements, on synth, and it kind of has the same super sustained out kind of vibe, and you can actually probably do more with a synth than you can an organ. I mean, an organ definitely has drawbar settings that you can mess with and different volume tricks you can do, and some of the people, like Corey or like a Travis Sales or Shedrick Mitchell can really do some weird things with just all the settings. They just know them in and out, so it turns it into a synth. But I think a synth is still very, very unique because you have so many different frequencies you can mess with. You can add on, LFOs and envelopes, and those things combined with church movements end up giving you a really kind of unique dynamic. I think in terms of how I approach synthesis, I think a lot of the music that influenced me was both indie rock and electronic music. I was listening to a ton of you had the cliche kind of artists that people listen to, like Radiohead and Bjork and people like that. But man, once I started hearing people like James Blake or even a guy like Skrillex or a guy like Zed, new producers, you kind of hear them take synthesis and do these really unique things that you haven't heard before. James Blake actually did a ton of, if you really focus on his first records before he kind of blew up, he was doing a ton of really interesting church movements in his playing anyway. So, maybe he was the first guy that I heard do that. So, yeah, I think indie rock in general, bands like Death Cab for Cutie, bands like Tycho have some really great synth sounds. Those people influence me the most. How are you? I am doing wonderfully. I'm having a blast. I hope you guys are enjoying this too. Even though I have good shows, comparing myself to others makes me feel inadequate. Thoughts? This is a deep one. I will try to answer it quickly, but I could probably give a whole masterclass just on this question. The regular answer that you're going to hear from, I think, most of my friends and probably most people in the scene is, don't compare yourself to anyone but yourself, which generally is a very, very, very great thing to do. I think it's probably mentally the most healthy thing to do, because if you're constantly battling yourself, you can kind of grow in your own unique way, and it can be something where you don't really get any of the negative benefits of competition. That being said, and this might be an unpopular answer, but if you choose to make music your living, you kind of have to compare yourself slightly to what's going on in the scene. Now, I don't mean to say that you should try and be any other player. I definitely want to focus on people being unique and really coming up with their own sound. But I will say, something that I had to do up in New York was I went up to New York and I came with a very set way of thinking. I wasn't really big into reharming when I moved up there. I had been practicing almost nothing but time and groove, and so I would go to hip-hop jam sessions, and I would just play the same thing over and over again, which in that scene that I was doing was pretty unique, because almost everyone was like reharming Magoo, which is great, but when you're trying to play hip-hop, you have to think about loops, and so for a while I was really stuck in the whole, no, I'm not going to play anything but a loop mindset. Now, that being said, I started to look around the scene and notice who was getting work, and I would see people like Yuki or like Jake Sherman or my buddy Christian Almiron who would be playing around town, and they were getting all the work, and I was getting almost nothing. So I really kind of had to look at, like, okay, why is this happening? And it turned out that there was a certain amount of, you had to have the ability to play loops. If that was the call, you had to be able to do it. But there was also some of the scene that wanted to be impressed, and there were some of the artists that wanted to be impressed before they hired you. So I did have to kind of compare myself with, okay, how were these people approaching their art? I didn't want to steal their approach by any means, but I was definitely influenced by it. And so I think comparing yourself to the scene you're in, comparing yourself to whatever benchmark you place for yourself, a lot of it can be kind of a self-competition. But I do think that, there are bits and pieces of competing with the scene that, like it or not, if you're trying to make money in this business, you have to do. So it's kind of a weird thing that you have to approach it that way, but that's at least how I did it. I feel like I've plateaued and I'm not making much progress in playing keys these days. Any advice? The easiest advice I can give quickly is to just switch it up. Doing something like, if you only listen to blues, don't listen to blues. If you only listen to hip-hop, maybe transcribe some rock records. I found that stuff will eventually bring you back to what you love, but sometimes you just have to totally switch it up. You can switch it up with who you play for, you can switch up where you live if you're so lucky to have the budget to do that. But yeah, I think just try practicing something that you had never thought about practicing before. If you only work on solos, maybe work on time. If you always work on time, maybe work on solos. So switching it up, I think, is a really good way to kind of upstart your progress a little bit. What role do pedals have in your live rig? I'm actually going to be doing a video on my YouTube channel about this pretty soon, because I think I use pedals in a fairly unique way. I have kind of a combination of utilities I take advantage of. I'll do something where I have some help. I'll have like a reverb or a delay or something that is going to help the overall sound. But I also, on my pedal boards, like to be really interactive. The pedals that I mentioned earlier, the Judder, the MWFX pedal, and the Tensor, the Red Panda pedal, are both pedals that I can actually do rhythmic tricks with. And I do rhythmic tricks with them by playing and interacting as I'm playing. So it's almost like I'm doing sort of a live automation to the sound. So my pedals kind of take on two different roles, where I have instruments, like extra instruments to kind of help my playing out, and then I also have additives to the sound like reverb and things that will kind of thicken it up a little bit. Favorite piano trio album and why? I think the Bill Evans Live at the Village Vanguard, I believe. I think that was the record with Paul Motion and Scott LaFaro on it. That, if I'm correct, that was the one that hit me the hardest. I've never been super into jazz, so that one was maybe the one that hit me the most. I can also say, man, Medeski, Martin, and Wood, I don't know if that counts as a piano trio, but that trio got so much sound for 3 people. And I remember seeing them when I turned 20 years old down in Lawrence, Kansas, and then I've been lucky enough to play some festivals that they were at. And they just were such a big vibe for 3 people. And there were so many pedals on stage, and they just had this very kind of like angry, dark thing going on. So I think any of their records, man. End of the World Party was pretty great. The record, It's a Jungle in Here, I transcribed a lot of that record. That has some great songs on it. How has your sound progressed since you became a funk apostle? Ooh, that is a wonderful question. I think that I've had to really kind of focus on what my role is, especially lately, especially the last few years. I really, when the band started, it was very keyboard centric, and at the time Andrew Bailey was playing guitar, and I think the keyboard just kind of took charge of the whole thing, and it was just like, let me put all of the, let me be a horn player and a pad guy and a melodic guy all at one time, and really just go in on the keyboard phrasing. And Corey was doing the same thing, and I think since then, I really love what Adam Agati does in that band now, and he's playing guitar with us now, and so I'm trying. He would probably say I'm not as good at it as he wants me to be, but he's a really special player, and so I've been trying to focus more on, okay, how can I complement Corey? How can I complement Adam? So my sound's progressed, I guess, hopefully in a little bit more disciplined of a sense, and I think also I've just really gotten a great confidence by being in a band. It's something to where Corey, to me, is one of the greatest keyboard players in the history of the planet, and the fact that he's trusted me to play in that band means a lot to me. So it's given me a confidence to really be myself and come out and just do my vibe. It's my vibe definitely isn't a traditional thing, and it's really been good to be in a group that kind of says, hey, do you, be in a support role, but do you. So that's how it's progressed so far. Any tips for improvisation on the keys? Transcribe. That's the hugest part, is transcribe. Go back and listen to, if you're into jazz, go listen to Miles Davis and Charlie Parker and John Coltrane. If you're into blues, like take apart some Muddy Waters stuff, take apart some Pinetop Perkins piano work, and just really focus on, just learning what the people before you have done. Some people talk to me about how they don't want to become someone else's sound, and I guess I'll address that in this question too, to where you have to remember that each time you transcribe, you're not just becoming that thing that you learned. If I transcribe 2 John Coltrane solos, you have to remember that you're taking his vibes and putting it onto your life. So when he's playing, he's coming from his life experience. When you play, you're coming from yours. So when you start thinking of it that way, and you also start mixing and matching different musical styles, it's like you're baking a cake. You really are just combining this random ingredient after random ingredient. And I think it's something to where if you just study the things you like, and not learn what you think you should, transcribing the things I like, to me, has meant learning some Parker, learning some Miles, but also transcribing a Meshuggah bass line or like learning a Johnny Greenwood guitar solo. So I come at it from a different place. Or, I used to transcribe sequences from a band called The Knife that my friend Neil Duffy showed me. They would have these really intense kind of like randomized sequences, and I would just find them really beautiful. So I would learn the sequence, even though it was a random thing. It would kind of be all over the place. But it gave me some interesting phrasing. So tips for improvisation on the keys: just really transcribe everything and do it, learn it in every key, do it as often as you possibly can. Favorite resources for synth programming? There's lots of great YouTube videos about this, but I think the best thing you can do is just experiment. When I first got my Prophet, I couldn't even turn the thing on. I turned it on, nothing was happening. It was a mess. It turns out I just had the cutoff knob all the way down. So we all have to come from somewhere. But I think that, yeah, just the more you experiment, I would say experiment with learning one knob at a time. If you're on something like a Prophet 8 or a Rev 2, there's so many knobs on those that if you try and approach the whole thing, you're just going to go absolutely crazy. So really focus on just saying, okay, I'm going to take the ADSR section, or I'm going to take the envelope section, and really just focus on hearing what that does to the sound, because you won't be able to combine all those things, until you understand what each one of them does separately. I noticed a few of these questions as I was looking at the original questions. Someone asked me how I met Corey. I met Corey playing up in New York, kind of two different ways. I was doing some modern gospel gigs, playing with a gentleman named Chris Jackson, and so he would come out to that scene. But then I'm also a part of a band or a collective called The Lesson, and we did an event every week up there that was like this really weird kind of experimental, improvised hip-hop thing. And, I got a lot of information from that, and I came a long way, especially synth-wise, because of that band too. Shout out to Lenny Reese, Phase One, Jonathan Horde, David Cutler, Christian Almiron, all the Lesson homies, Rabbi Darkside, Julian. I think he started coming out to that session, and when he started the Funk Apostles, it was something to where he just wanted to be very different than Snarky, I think. He had been playing with Snarky Puppy, and that's an amazing band for a while, but he wanted to have something that he put his stamp on, and, it was a situation to where I think I just gave him kind of a weird conglomeration of church and synth and everything, and so yeah, I met him up in New York. Anyway, I'm going to log off of this Q&A. Thank you guys for sticking around. I will be saving this video and posting it to my YouTube channel so you guys can reference some of these. Thank you for the wonderful questions. I'll probably be doing these once a month or so, just because I think that you guys are asking me really deep questions, and I want to take the time to really put some thought into them next time. So thank you guys, and hopefully I see you soon. Take care.